Hi, Tim here, and I'd like to say a few words about the modern English translations that we have and about the differences between them. Some of the differences are based upon textual issues. They are translated from different texts. That's why there's a difference. But the biggest reason that there is a difference between them all is the philosophy behind that particular translation. And they basically run in a spectrum from what is called formal equivalence on one hand and dynamic equivalence on the other. Now I'd like to show you how this works. Let's take a phrase from Psalm 51. Now Psalm 51 comes from an episode in King David's life where he had been confronted by the prophet Nathan. He had just committed murder, adultery, and conspiracy. And this psalm is his prayer for forgiveness. And let's look at one phrase from this psalm. And this is how it appears in the Masoretic text. Now, the Masoretic text is the Hebrew text that most of the modern English Old Testaments come from. So let's begin. The first word, lev, literally means the heart, the blood pump, the organ. But metaphorically, it refers to the internal thoughts, emotions, and feelings and things that go on inside of us. In modern English, we refer to this as the mind, usually, or even the brain. In Asian cultures, it was that divide between mind and heart didn't really happen. Like in Japanese, you have the kokoro, which is the psychic center of a human being. Or in China, they use the heart as well. Or even up in modern Mongolia, the center of a person's being was in the liver. So instead of having a heartache, you'd have a liver ache. But in ancient Israel, it was the heart, was the center of a person. Next word, tahor, means to clean, but not in the sense of washing something, more as in the sense of purifying, like you would refine metal. And it is an adjective. It's describing something, and it infers more of a ritual pureness or an ethical or moral pureness. Next word, bara, which means to bring into existence, to create. Not in the sense of taking wood and fashioning a piece of furniture. It's not making something. It's causing to exist out of nothing. And this would very much infer to the Hebrew reader the creation story in Genesis, the account of God bringing the universe into existence out of the primeval chaos. And then lai, unto or for, and the first person pronoun me or I. Then we have Elohim, God. El, God, with the plural ending im, referring to that this is the God above all the rest of the gods, more of like a royal sense. Now, if we were to translate this phrase with formal equivalence and try to go word for word, it would read something like this. Mind, pure, cause to exist for me, God. Now, of course, you would realize this is terrible sounding English. And that's kind of the problem with a kind of a formal equivalence, a word-for-word translations. They can sound very awkward. And also, the biggest problem with a formal equivalence is there's really no such thing. There is never really a word-for-word correlation between languages. All we can do is try to find an English word that best matches the thought behind the Hebrew word. Now, if we were to go the other way and come up with a dynamic equivalent translation for this phrase, we can go something more like this. Refine my thoughts, O God. Or if you want to go really far, you can say, clean my brain. Would probably work. But you see, the further you go that way, the more you get to a paraphrase. You get far away from the original Hebrew. In far as our modern English translations goes, You have something like the New American Standard, which is very literal, very formal equivalent, word-for-word translation. It renders this phrase, "Create in me a clean heart, O God," contrasted with perhaps the Message Bible, which reads, "God, make a fresh start in me. Shape a Genesis week out of the chaos of my life." See, that sounds great, and it catches some of the nuance or intention behind some of the Hebrew words. But yet you see we're very far away from the original Hebrew at that point. See, there's pros and cons to both philosophies. There's neither a right or a wrong to either one of them. Well, the thing with the dynamic equivalent is the further you go that way, the more interpretation the translator puts in, the more bias enters into it. And whereas the problem with the word-for-word formal equivalent is there's really no such thing. And the further you go that way, the more it turns into gibberish and very difficult to read. So we have our modern English translations. It's the New American Standard, which is a little more formal equivalent. And actually, it's probably the most to that end of things, the most word-for-word we have. Whereas the Message Bible, New Living Translation, and those are towards the dynamic end. You have something like the New International Version, which tries very hard to be down the middle, use both dynamic and formal equivalents. And then you have the King James, New King James, and all of those different versions that came from the King James, which is a little more towards the literal word-for-word end of things. So which one is best? Which one should we go with? Well, they're all good, but you need to remember they're all just translations. I would even suggest maybe having one of each. A very dynamic one and a very formal equivalent one. And if you want to do more of an in-depth Bible study, obviously you want one that's more word for word, either New American Standard or even a interlinear, which has the Hebrew with the English underneath it, or the Greek with the English underneath it. And I would also I could even recommend the New English Translation. It's probably one of the newest ones that are out there. It's very much a word-for-word translation, but it reads very well. And if you can get it with the translator's notes, they're amazingly helpful. And there's also a whole plethora of tools out there that can help anybody who's really interested in the language that's behind our English translations, like Bible dictionaries, lexicons, interlinear versions, and such. And these tools are very useful, even to someone with a very tertiary understanding of biblical languages. So we have all of these modern English translations. And a lot of people like to argue for one versus another, saying that, oh, the version they have is less biased than other ones. But the truth is they all are biased in their own ways. Now, there is a tendency to get stuck on a particular translation, thinking it's the better one. They all have their issues. And you have, of course, the issues with the formal equivalents, and you have the issues with the dynamic equivalents, and the issues of which text did they use to translate this from, and all of this. But the important thing to remember is here, they are all just translations. They're not the original. And I think the biggest mistake we can make there is to get hung up on any particular wording in English. And besides, if your doctrine or theology is dependent upon a single verse being worded a single way in English, you probably have missed the point somewhere.